Now, first, let me just simply deal with the issue of those of you who are here, who are not preachers, who are grieved and exasperated by what you don't hear. What should you do? Quit? Go somewhere else? I'm going to tell you it's probably worse somewhere else than where you are right now. That's not a very hopeful thing. What if you were to commit yourself to pray that the preacher in your church would learn to preach, and that the sermons would become as powerful as Paul's, or if you will, Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones? Now, as I said, it was in my mind to expound that portion in 2 Timothy 4, but that's been done already better than I could do. So let me illustrate what I believe it means. I'll do this in a Lutheran fashion if it will not be too offensive. Well, actually, in truth, even if it offends you, I'm going to do it, so I'm not going to pay any attention. Lutherans love to have both an Old Testament text and a New Testament text. And I'm going to do that this afternoon. Let me ask you to turn first to the Old Testament text. Now, I know we've been hearing about expository preaching, and I'm certainly not an opponent of expository preaching. But I think some of you are not very smart on that subject either. I don't know how anybody dares to think there's something wrong with topical preaching. You know that some of the greatest revival in the history of the world have occurred from preaching on the doctrine of regeneration. Often at communion services, in the old days when communion was not something tacked on the end of a service, but when 6 days were given to preparation for communion, and then on the Saturday, people had to pass an examination and receive a token in order that they might be seated at the table of the Lord. In those days of powerful preaching, topical sermons on preparation for communion, God often came in a powerful and revolutionary reformational fashion. Don't you dare knock topical or textual preaching. You may think the other is better, and you're welcome to your opinion, and I'm certainly myself a believer in expository preaching, but I also believe in topical preaching and in textual preaching. Well, I'm going to tell you what I really think the difference is between teaching and preaching. I believe teaching is aimed at the mind, and that preaching is aimed at the heart. And the teacher prepares by discovering the mind of God in Scripture. But the preacher prepares by discovering the heart of God in his prayer closet. Not that he is unaffected by the word, but true preaching is when the heart of God affects the preacher, and then the congregation is affected by the heart of God as it affected the preacher. That, I believe, is a desperate need of the hour. But I've invited your attention to a passage in the book of Isaiah, and I ask you to turn specifically to chapter 57. And we're only going to focus upon a single verse, though I honestly think that if we're wise to do so, I could adequately give you the context. I just don't think that's necessary at this point. I want you to see the text itself. Isaiah 57:15. Thus says the high and the exalted one who lives forever, whose name is holy. I dwell on a high and holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. It is my profound conviction that all of us are in danger of fussing around, speaking against the fruits of sin, and never touching the roots. I think abortion is a fruit and not the root. And I don't believe that any amount of pruning fruits off a tree is going to change the roots. It's my conviction that there is an interrelationship between these four matters. What I think of God impacts what I think of myself. That impacts what I think of sin. And that impacts what I think of salvation. Honestly, I believe the evangelical church in America is teaching a doctrine of salvation that is absolutely absurd. Makes God an idiot. We've got people who think they've been saved from the penalty of sin, who know perfectly well they haven't been saved from the power of sin. They have loved sin all their lives, and they love it now as much as they ever did. But they thought, having been told this foolishness, that if they would pray a prayer, they would become subjects of the kingdom of heaven. And as I said already, that makes God absolutely stupid. God hates sin to such an extent that he creates a hell in which to imprison forever in a life of misery those who love sin. And then he puts his arm around his son and says, now go down there and save them from the penalty and leave them with the problem. How dumb can you get? But can we correct the problem that now exists in the church by attacking erroneous views of salvation? Well, you see, that would be like going after the fruit. If the wrong view of salvation is to be corrected, the wrong view of sin has got to be corrected. And the wrong view of self has got to be corrected. And we've got to have God's own view of himself. May I ask you, do you think about God the way God thinks about himself? Do you know the God who reveals himself in Holy Scripture, or do you only know the God that your church has imagined him to be? There's an incredible distance between the God of the human imagination and the God of self-revelation in Scripture.